Cleopatra is often remembered for her beauty, power, and allure, but perhaps her greatest enemy was not Rome, but her own biology. New scientific analysis is forcing historians to look beyond the legend, because the Ptolemaic bloodline was shaped by generations of incestuous marriages, where royal DNA slowly became a silent threat. Her tomb has not yet been opened, but bones, medical clues, and disputed remains already point to a darker battle beneath the crown. This was not only a struggle against empires, but a fight against inheritance itself. So when science finally reaches the queen, will it reveal strength or a curse waiting to rise? Cleopatra's tomb is believed to be lost beneath modern Alexandria, a city shaped by earthquakes, sinking ground, and a coastline that keeps moving. Many historians say the last pharaoh vanished into that chaos, buried where no shovel can reach and no map still matches. But one investigator refused to accept a neat ending. Kathleen Martinez, a criminal lawyer from the Dominican Republic who retrained as an archaeologist, treats Cleopatra's disappearance like a case file with missing pages. Instead of chasing legends, she follows motive, location, and ritual, asking what Cleopatra would choose if she feared capture more than death. That logic pulls the search west of Alexandria to Taposiris Magna, a ruined temple complex once tied to Isis worship. For Martinez, it is not a random stop, because ancient power often hid behind sacred doors, and a queen planning her final move would want a place that looked ordinary to her enemies. Then came the turn. In 2022, excavators working under the temple reported a man-made tunnel cut deep into the rock, about 1,305 meters long, roughly 43 feet below the surface and partially flooded. Officials called it a geometric miracle, and its precision reminded engineers of the Tunnel of Eupalinos in Greece. It was the kind of structure built for purpose, not decoration, and it pointed toward the sea as if it was meant to connect to something beyond the walls. So what exactly was this tunnel built to protect, and where does it finally lead right now? The tunnel is the first physical clue that turns Cleopatra's story from rumor into something you can measure. It is not a metaphor, not a symbol on a coin, but a real cut through rock, and that kind of cut always costs time, labor, and risk. Under the ruins of Taposiris Magna, archaeologists reported a passage carved about 13 meters below the surface, deep enough that daylight and sound faded fast. It runs for roughly 1,305 meters, which is about 4,281 feet, and it stands close to 2 meters high, so a person can walk it without crawling. Parts of it sit under water and mud today, yet its line stays steady, aiming toward the Mediterranean as if it was planned to reach a shoreline that once looked different. The tunnel was found by an Egyptian Dominican mission linked to the University of Santo Domingo, and images show walls, tight corners, and a ceiling that had to be stabilized. Even now, waterlogging hints the builders fought seepage from coastal ground. Pause for a quick decode, because the numbers matter. A tunnel this long is not a decorative hallway. It is closer to infrastructure, the kind built to move water, people, or secrets, and it takes careful surveying to keep a straight path underground. Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities even described it as an engineering miracle, and that is a rare phrase for an official announcement. The design also triggers a famous comparison. Researchers and reporters linked it to the Tunnel of Eupalinos on the Greek island of Samos, a 6th century BCE aqueduct tunnel that runs 1,036 meters through a mountain and is celebrated for its geometry and planning. That link is not made to sound poetic. It is made because both projects show the same idea: Someone trusted math more than luck, and they were willing to dig in the dark until precision won. So why would that kind of precision appear beneath a temple most tourists barely know? Taposiris Magna was not the center of the ancient world like Alexandria, and that is exactly what makes the tunnel unsettling. If you want to hide something from political enemies, you do not place it under a spotlight. You pick a site that looks quiet, then you build the real pathway underneath it. Kathleen Martinez's team has argued that the location fits Cleopatra's final problem. After Octavian's victory, Cleopatra faced a future where her body could be captured, displayed, and turned into a warning. A hidden burial would be more than pride, it would be defense. The tunnel, in that reading, is not just stone, it is an escape route for memory. Another decode moment helps here. Ancient tunnels often served water systems, and many scholars have suggested this passage could have been part of an aqueduct, especially since it heads toward the sea and sits at a workable depth. Yet even if it carried water, the scale still signals power, because only a wealthy authority could organize the tools, the crews, and the patience to complete it. And now the story tightens. A straight corridor in solid rock is like a sentence that ends with a period. It tells you someone knew exactly what they wanted on the other side, and they were confident it was worth burying beneath decades of sand and collapse. If this tunnel was built to reach a final chamber, then the next question is simple and dangerous. What kind of people would be placed near an entrance like this, and what clues would they leave behind to announce who was meant to arrive? The tunnel is unsettling, but the tombs around it make the site feel awake, because they suggest someone was preparing for an arrival. At Taposiris Magna, the Egyptian and Dominican mission led by Kathleen Martinez reported rock-cut tombs from the Greco-Roman period, and widely reported coverage describes 16 burials inside them. The find was publicized by Egypt's antiquities authorities in early 2021. When the chambers were opened, the bodies were in poor condition, yet one detail still flashed in the dust. Archaeologists found thin gold foil amulets shaped like tongues placed inside the mouths of some mummies. Egypt's officials explained that the ritual was meant to ensure the dead could speak in the afterlife, especially when facing the court of Osiris, the god of the underworld. Pause and decode what that really means. A gold tongue is not jewelry. It is a promise that speech will not end with death, and in a culture where judgment after death mattered, a voice could be the difference between peace and punishment. The amulet turns a silent body into a witness, someone who can answer, confess, and plead. That is why this choice feels deliberate, not random. The number 16 matters too, and not because it sounds dramatic. It means this was a community of burials, not a single isolated grave, so the site carried a continuing purpose across time. These rock-cut tombs were a common style in that era, but the objects inside them are what raised the temperature of the story. They were not buried with plain silence. They were buried with tools for a journey. Reports from the same excavation add more texture. One mummy was described with gilded decoration, and another was said to wear a crown with horns and a cobra at the forehead. Those symbols signal protection and authority, and they hint that these people were not ordinary villagers. Even if their names are lost, the message of their burial is clear. Someone invested in how they would be seen beyond the grave. This is where Martinez's theory steps in, and it should be treated as a hypothesis, not a confirmed conclusion. She believes Taposiris Magna could be tied to Cleopatra's final plan, and the golden tongues fit like a clue in a case file. If these burials belonged to priests, courtiers, or allies close to the royal circle, then their amulets could serve another role. They could speak on behalf of someone greater, and they could be ready to introduce a queen who wanted to be remembered as sacred. The idea is chilling because it matches the politics of Cleopatra's world. She ruled in a time when bodies were weapons. A captured queen could be paraded, mocked, and turned into a warning, so hiding her resting place would be an act of survival even after death. In that context, a cluster of carefully prepared burials starts to look like a protective ring, a human curtain drawn in front of a secret door. Now zoom out and picture the scene. 16 burials sit inside rock-cut spaces near a temple linked with Isis worship, and several mouths hold gold meant for speech before Osiris. It feels less like a cemetery and more like a room built for waiting, as if the dead were told to keep their voices ready. So if these tongues were placed here to speak for someone, who were they meant to greet? And what would the next discovery have to show to prove the queen ever came this way? Cleopatra's hunt does not stay in tunnels for long because biology offers a shortcut when a body is missing. If you cannot test the queen herself, you look for a close blood relative, and in Cleopatra's world, that path is stained with violence. Her family was not a peaceful dynasty. It was a court where brothers married sisters, allies became threats overnight, and survival often meant striking first. In that shark tank, Cleopatra's most dangerous rival was not a Roman commander, but her own younger sister, Arsinoe IV. When Cleopatra was pushed out of power, Arsinoe stepped into the gap and claimed the throne. Then Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, and the civil war turned brutal and personal. Ancient accounts describe Arsinoe as a teenager who led resistance against Caesar and even trapped him inside the palace during the fighting. She was eventually captured and taken to Rome, where she was forced to walk in Caesar's triumph. Crowds reportedly pitied her, and that public sympathy saved her from execution. Instead, she was exiled to Ephesus, in what is now Turkey, and placed under the protection of the Temple of Artemis, one of the most famous sacred sites of the ancient world. But sacred ground did not stop politics. In 41 BCE, Cleopatra persuaded Mark Antony to order Arsinoe's death. Assassins dragged her from the temple steps and killed her in a moment that shocked even people used to royal cruelty. It was a scandal, yet it left something investigators love: a clear location. The crime had an address, and for modern researchers that mattered, because it offered a possible link to physical remains. Decades later, that link seemed to appear. Archaeologists in Ephesus had identified a distinctive tomb called the Octagon, and inside they found a skeleton of a young person. The tomb's shape and prominence sparked a theory that it was built for someone important, and one scholar argued it echoed the octagonal form associated with Alexandria's famous lighthouse. The logic was simple. Arsinoe died in Ephesus, she was royal, and this was an unusual royal-looking monument in the right city. For years, the octagon skeleton was treated like a mirror held up to Cleopatra herself. If the bones belonged to Arsinoe, then the DNA inside them could reveal shared ancestry, possible health traits, and long-argued questions about Cleopatra's origins. That is why the story grew beyond archaeology. It became a cultural battleground because one set of bones seemed able to settle arguments that have lasted for generations. Yet the mirror was always fragile. Early DNA work failed because the remains had been handled too many times, and contamination can erase genetic signals like fingerprints wiped from glass. The skull itself had a chaotic history, with records saying it was measured and photographed before it was lost during World War II. When a key piece of evidence goes missing, belief tends to fill the gap. In recent years, that gap began to close. Reports said the long-lost skull was located again in a university collection, which meant researchers could stop relying on old measurements and start using modern scanning. A case that had lived on drawings and guesswork suddenly had a physical object back on the table. Now the pressure builds, because the octagon was never just a tomb. It was a promise that science could finally touch Cleopatra's family, and that promise created expectations that may be too heavy for any single skeleton to carry. So what happens if the remains are not who everyone thinks and the DNA key was never hers at all? For decades, the octagon skeleton looked like the cleanest shortcut to Cleopatra because one set of bones in the right city seemed able to answer questions that texts could not. Scholars argued on paper, and the tomb carried the weight of an identity it never truly proved. Then the evidence returned to the table. In January 2025, a research team linked to the University of Vienna published a detailed reanalysis and scientific reports, and they treated the cranium like a locked hard drive. They used micro-CT scanning to build a high-resolution digital map, which meant they could study the inside without destroying the object. The scan reached about 80 micrometers, so tiny patterns in bone growth became visible and measurable. Quick decode. Scans show structure, but DNA decides identity, and the petrous bone acts like a sealed vault against time for us. Next came the part that changed everything. Ancient DNA work is hard because modern handling can leave a genetic fog, and earlier tests had struggled with contamination and missing signals. This time, the team sampled dense tissue from the petrous part of the skull, near the inner ear, because that region often protects DNA better than most bones. With strict lab controls, they extracted enough data to test the basic claim that had ruled the story for a century. The result was blunt. The person in the octagon was not female because the genetic profile included a Y chromosome. The famous sister of Cleopatra collapsed into a different person entirely, and the scans backed that up with age estimates. Instead of a young royal woman, the remains matched an adolescent boy, around 11 to 14 years old. In a single move, the mirror that people used to imagine Cleopatra's face cracked down the center. The medical picture was even more unsettling. The micro-CT model showed major developmental disturbances, including strong asymmetry and abnormal growth of the skull and jaw. Some expert commentary compared the pattern to severe disorders that can reshape the face in childhood, although the study itself stays careful with labels. Either way, this was not a healthy political exile. It was a child whose body had been struggling long before he died. And the shock did not stop with sex and age. Genetic markers suggested ancestry tied to the Italian peninsula or Sardinia, not Egypt. That detail turns the octagon from a royal clue into a new mystery, because the tomb sits in a prominent position in Ephesus and looks like a monument meant to be seen. So why would a boy with roots across the sea be placed there? Was he connected to an elite household, chosen for a ritual role, or buried as a symbolic substitute? This is the moment when Cleopatra's identity debate loses its strongest physical prop. The octagon can no longer be used as proof of her ancestry, her appearance, or her supposed DNA, because it never belonged to her sister at all. The deeper lesson is uncomfortable. When one artifact becomes a symbol, people start seeing what they want to see, and the symbol grows until it blocks the real person behind it. So the hunt returns to Cleopatra, but now it moves with fewer shortcuts and more caution. If the bones cannot speak for her, then the next step is to examine what we do know for sure about her family line, and that is where the real biological danger begins. Who else in her dynasty shows the pattern, and what does it suggest about the queen herself? The darkest clue about Cleopatra is not a rumor in a tomb, but a pattern locked into her family tree. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as a Macedonian Greek dynasty, and they protected power by pairing close relatives, including brothers with sisters. Encyclopedia Britannica notes that Ptolemy XII married Cleopatra V and calls her his sister, which shows how close kin unions could be treated as policy, not private scandal. This matters because inbreeding does not just change appearance, it raises the odds that hidden harmful genes will surface. Biologists use a number called the inbreeding coefficient to describe how likely it is that the same gene copy is inherited from both parents. In a University of Washington genetics teaching exercise that reconstructs the Ptolemaic pedigree, Cleopatra VII's coefficient is calculated as 0.43359,375, meaning more than 40%. It is a model based on an assumed lineage, yet it captures the scale of repeated close marriages. Quick decode: when the same ancestors appear again and again, the body loses its genetic safety net. Recessive conditions have more chances to match, immune problems can rise, and even basic traits like bone strength can drift in a dangerous direction. It is not magic, it is math, and the math gets cruel when a dynasty keeps shutting out new blood. That risk never vanishes, even under a crown. To grasp the scale, compare it with the Spanish Habsburgs, a royal house famous for intermarriage. A 2009 study rebuilt the Habsburg pedigree and calculated King Charles II of Spain at about 0.254, while also showing how inbreeding climbed generation by generation. Even at that lower level, Charles II's health was disastrous, and he died without an heir, ending his line. If Cleopatra's estimate sits near 0.43, the Ptolemaic risk was even more severe. The Ptolemaic record hints at strain in ways that are strangely physical. Ancient descriptions and portraits depict some rulers as extremely obese, and coins show heavy family traits like thick necks and strong jaws. Modern writers sometimes point to thyroid disorders as one possible explanation for the mix of swelling and eye prominence, because Graves' disease can cause a goiter and bulging eyes and can also drive rapid heartbeat, tremors, and sleep trouble. That does not prove Cleopatra had it, but it explains why researchers keep looking for medical shadows behind the legend. Then the paradox hits. Cleopatra is not remembered as a broken figure. She negotiated with Rome, held authority in a collapsing world, and bore children, which suggests fertility that often drops first in heavily inbred lines. She also seems to have avoided the deformities that haunted other intermarrying dynasties. So the mystery is not whether her bloodline was risky, it is how she managed to live and rule inside it. One answer is simple chance. Genetics is a dice roll, and a rare person can inherit fewer damaging combinations even from a dangerous pedigree. Another answer is darker, because survival is not the same as health. A person can function while paying hidden costs in pain, mood shifts, or long-term strain that ancient writers would describe as temperament instead of symptoms. And this brings us back to the sand in the tunnel, because if Kathleen Martinez ever finds Cleopatra's remains, the bones will not just tell us who she was, they may show what the dynasty did to her body. So when the tomb finally opens, will it reveal a miracle or a woman who ruled while quietly fighting the inheritance she could never escape? Cleopatra now stands between two truths because the evidence no longer supports a simple legend. She may have been a rare genetic miracle who slipped through an impossible bloodline, or a silent sufferer whose strength hid constant strain beneath the crown. Her brilliance, restless energy, and charisma could have acted as a shield, turning private struggle into public authority. Ancient writers describe a ruler who spoke many languages, negotiated without fear, and moved faster than her rivals. Yet biology reminds us that sharp minds can coexist with fragile bodies. Cleopatra also understood chemistry and medicine, and that knowledge may have been practical, not decorative. Cosmetics, perfumes, and carefully shaped images were tools for control in a world where appearance decided loyalty, survival, and power. Managing the body was part of ruling an empire. Today, Kathleen Martinez continues to dig beneath Taposiris Magna, guided by ritual clues, architecture, and unanswered questions. The tunnel remains flooded, the chamber unopened, and certainty still out of reach. So the mystery remains suspended between stone and science. If the tomb is opened tomorrow, what will it reveal? A queen who escaped a genetic curse, or a ruler who conquered the world while fighting her DNA?